Thank you all for coming back. And I want to thank Althea for organizing this, and I should thank also Andrew Hardy, who's my research assistant, who helped me find a lot of the really old translations that I'll cite, some of the really earliest translations. And I should thank the DePaul Humanities Center also, which is kind of sponsoring it. I'm a fellow at the center this year, which gave me the kind of time to be able to do this as an extra thing. I thought to start off with, I would talk a little bit more about why I'm interested in, why look at the different ways it's been read rather than try to just explain the meaning of the text. And it's actually really easy for me to think about, and I've been really excited all this past couple of weeks preparing this, because to me there's something just amazing about how this short text that's really 5,000 words becomes probably millions of pages of materials in all different languages across all different time periods. Like, there's something amazing about that production of meaning that comes out of this text, you know. And so partly I think that's a testament to the DaodeJing, that there's some core there that speaks to people in so many different contexts. But there's something I feel like interesting just about, I don't know, almost about human creativity. Like, there's something amazing about that production of meaning and that creation of meaning in all those different contexts. So I'm interested in partly just to try to understand that better and understand, you know, how that happens. What are the factors that let that happen, you know? I think another aspect of it that I keep thinking about, and I should say I'm talking about this stuff partly because I'm trying to figure it out myself, so it's more interesting to think through because I'm trying to figure it out. But it's just thinking about the process of reading a really foreign text or a really ancient text and how that works, you know. And so I think we tend to have a naive view that there's like this book with its meaning, and then there's me, and I get the meaning from the book, or I don't understand it, or I do understand it, or I like it, or I don't like it, right? And I think that's not really what happens when we're actually reading these things. There really is some kind of merging of our own perspective and these remnants of the book that we have, these written words that we have, that Foster Gadamer calls it a fusion of horizons. I don't know if that's the best metaphor, but there is some like merging of the two that produces something new. So I often think, like when I write about Chinese texts, that the stuff I'm saying, I could never have come up with on my own if I hadn't read those books. But it's not what those books are saying or what those people themselves would have thought or would have said. Like, it's something I feel like genuinely new that comes out of that kind of encounter with these ancient texts that's not reducible to me or to the book itself, you know. So trying to think about how that works, and I'm not sure still that much how to analyze that. But one thing I do think is that to have that be really productive, you can't get too close to one side or the other. And what I mean is that if it's too much just your own views, then it's more just like a mirror and you don't really get anything new out of it. It's just kind of repeating back to you what you already think in other words. I think that's the danger of some of the really loose translations of the Daodjing, is it really is not getting some foreign thing that's being conveyed to you. It's some contemporary person telling you what they think, basically, you know. I've been looking at Stephen Mitchell's translation recently, and I mentioned that I actually read it in a class on Chinese philosophy that I took. But it's really, really a loose translation. Like, there are parts, we'll look at one passage, but that really don't have much connection to what the text actually says, you know. Even if it's profound and interesting, right? It's not giving you something else, it's really giving you his kind of views. But on the other side, so you can't get too close to just your own subjective views. On the other hand, I think, and this is a danger more for scholars like myself, you don't want to take it as just a kind of historical artifact either, because then it doesn't really have any significance either, you know, and so it really has to be this kind of engagement between them. So kind of what I'm interested in, I guess, is how that works, how that produces stuff. A little bit of what is, maybe a little bit of how to evaluate what's produced out of it, although I haven't figured out that part yet, like what ends up being a good reading and not a good reading. I'm not sure how to think about that yet, but that's an interesting question, I think, that comes out of it too. In terms of like really concrete understanding the Daodjing, what I have in mind is two things. So one is that I think you understand the text better if you recognize where it's unclear, like where it could mean multiple things. And I'll sometimes ask my students who don't read Chinese, right, I'll give them several translations and ask them which one they like. which one's a better translation? And it's a kind of a trap because they can't read the original, so they can't really say which is a better translation, but they think that they can. And often what they'll say is that this one's a better translation because it's more clear. But that's usually the case where the original is not clear, and it could mean two different things. The translator picks one of those and gives that to you, and it's very easy to read. But you're really not getting the kind of what the text really is like, right? Yeah.
One of the things that struck me from your talk last week, and what you're addressing right now, is these are the very same problems that people have with, say, Christian or Jewish scripture. You know, it's like looking, and I have this one book on biblical exegesis, and it has like 7 different methods, you know, of looking at a text, and, you know, historical context and linguistic and all the rest of this. So I'm just curious, have you, as part of your scholarship in looking at texts like this, does it interface, do you look at that discipline of biblical scholarship for the tools to kind of go at a text like this also? Is there an overlap in technique, I guess?
Yeah, I think there is an overlap. I haven't looked at it that much myself. But in Western philosophy, the discipline of studying interpretation, right, is called hermeneutics.
Right.
And that really developed out of biblical interpretation. So the origins of that hermeneutics, that study, really came out of analyzing how people read scripture and how they interpret it different ways. So, in that sense, that whole sort of field of philosophy of interpretation is heavily influenced out of scriptural interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
There are some of the translations have Lafargue in it. He, I think, was trained in biblical scriptural methodology, and he's trying to apply that to the DaodeJing. So there are some people who have that training in both.
Mm.
But I think it's a lot of the same problems, you know.
Yeah.
There's maybe less at stake in some ways with the DaodeJing because there are I guess in the Taoist religious tradition who think it is something really like scripture, like divine
Mm-hmm.
words that then we have to be really careful about.
Well, yeah, the one thing that struck me when you and I were looking at it together was that there are a lot of things that people think are metaphorical that I don't think are. I think they are literal alchemical instructions, because if you understand those alchemical metaphors, there it is. And so it looks like they're talking about the magpie bridge and the bird flying or whatever, but they're actually talking about a movement of internal chi.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's one that I don't know well enough to be able to explain it in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of hope to find a commentary that would explain it in those terms, and I wasn't able to find one. But I've tried to read some of those texts, and I just can't make sense of them because I don't have the practice for it.
Maybe we should have a study group somehow on the airwaves of alchemical people, and we'll look at those texts.
Yeah, it would be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's probably several papers that could be written out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So today I'm probably going to talk about only like 4 chapters, because as I started going through them, I realized there are so many points that the translations vary in interesting ways on to comment on. But my hope is to kind of give you a sense of where there's variations in the original, where it actually is ambiguous, and then how that comes up in the translations. So a kind of better way to kind of get at what the original text looks like. So I always tell my students who don't read Chinese that, what they have to keep in mind is that they're trying to get at that original text. And so translations are the only point of access they have to it, other than talking to people about it, But otherwise, they just have translations. But you want to not confuse the translation with the original. And so what I always tell my students is they should read really like 3 translations. So if you read 3 translations, especially ones that are different from each other, you can start to see where the real variations are, where they're more consistent, those kinds of things.
Frank, what was that website that you gave me that lists all the various translations? That was fabulous.
It's down.
Oh,
I can't find it anymore.
Oh.
There was a German website that had, I think, 200 plus translations of the DaodeJing.
Wow.
And I think the problem was that, a good half of them were in copyright.
Mm.
And so I think they must have gotten in trouble. I would have thought it would have, once it's on the web, it's always on the web, but I haven't been able to find it again. There is a website that has 170 plus translations of chapter 1. And those are in chronological order, so it's pretty interesting to just kind of skim through those and see, how those are translated. Right, so then the other thing, just in terms of trying to understand the DaodeJing, is to become a little bit aware of the kinds of biases that come when we're trying to read the text, right? And so by looking at how other people, you can see how they're biased in different ways. I think you can become more aware of how your own biases play in, And so one example for me was the DaodeJing and all of the classical Chinese texts is that I'm not a theist myself. I don't believe in God, and I'm not that interested in philosophies that are based on God. So I'm biased away from anything that looks like it's talking about God in the Chinese text. And I know that. And so I've written the opposite stuff, arguing that there is, punishment and reward and these kinds of things. But I know that's a kind of intrinsic bias that I have, Or I know I like things that are kind of provocative. And so if you can read it in a way that's kind of prosaic advice, not very controversial, or you can read it in some really shocking way, I'm biased toward the shocking way. But I know that that's a bias, so I can be aware of it, So I thought by looking at these different translations and things, you could get a little bit of a sense of the different kinds of biases that go on that apply not just to the DaodeJing, but reading any difficult text. So one thing that I did, the selected translations that I handed out, there's actually 4 versions of that. So people have different versions that have different translations together. So I kind of thought this would give everybody one perspective on the passage. And then I'll talk about sort of analyze it more, but you can kind of see how the translation you happen to have gives a certain impression of the passage. Okay, so then I want to start off just a little bit kind of recapping the very end of last time. So the last time near the end, I mentioned some of the things that lead to the differences in interpretations in the DaodeJing, right? So one is different base text. So sometimes when translations are very different, it's because one is using a received version and one is using one of the recently discovered excavated versions, right? And so there's that question about what is the base text that you're using. The characters themselves are often very ambiguous, so that leads to lots of things. We'll look at examples of that today. And I'll say a little more about classical Chinese, right, in just a moment. You sometimes also have characters that sound the same, that get substituted for each other, people think. So it will actually be the wrong character. And you can struggle to figure out how this could possibly make sense. And then you read a commentary and they'll say, well, that's actually the wrong word. It should have been this word, which sounded the same at the time. So sometimes the ambiguities come out that way. There's lots of ones on the level of grammar. The question of the images or metaphors and how much to read into them. How much is implied in them. Think Althea's point about, how literal are they meant to be. All those are questions that open up all different kinds of interpretations. The question of how to read the text consistently is a big thing that adjusts interpretation. So if it says one thing in one place and another in another, and they seem contradictory, you have to get creative on how to fit them together. And I've said before that I don't think it was consistent. I don't think it was written by one person. So I think if you were looking at the true meaning, that's the wrong way to do it, I think. But that's part of what makes the interpretation so creative, is trying to make the whole book consistent with itself. I didn't mention this last time, but I added this bias toward what we wanted to say or what we expected to say. You see that in a lot of the translations. And then, of course, just the problem with, no English word maps exactly onto a Chinese word. So which one, you're going to choose certain aspects of the Chinese word. There's going to be new aspects that aren't in the Chinese word. That leads to a lot of the variations and problems. And I thought I would say a little bit more about Chinese language, just because I assume most of you don't read Chinese. So Althea has at least some knowledge of how it works from us reading through it, and a couple of my students know some. So classical Chinese, each character, right, it's not phonetic, it's written in characters, and each character is basically a word and one syllable. So pretty much each character is a word. There's some compound words like wu wei, I talked about last time, non-action, or ziran, this spontaneousness. But generally, each character is one word. That's different from modern Chinese, where each word is really 2 characters, generally. So a word is sort of a 2-character compound. That makes it much more specific. In classical Chinese, so if you think about it, there may be, to really read classical Chinese fairly well, you maybe need to know 5,000 characters, which seems like a lot of characters to learn, but it's not actually a lot of words, And so the words are necessarily ambiguous and hold a lot of functions because there's just not that many characters in terms of, compared to the number of words that you really need for a language. Most of the characters contain some image connected to the meaning, and those are usually images taken from nature, so they've got some connection with sort of natural phenomena, usually. And I'll give some examples of that. You can't add like a ed to a character to make it past tense, or like a apostrophe s to make it possessive, or an s to make it plural. So you can't modify the characters at all. And part of that then is that the grammar is kind of minimally marked. So generally, you don't know if a noun is singular or plural. And surprising how often it doesn't matter which one it is. Like, it's not generally that much of a problem, except unless you're translating, and then you have to decide if it's singular or plural. Tense is usually not marked also, so you usually can't tell if it's past tense or present or future unless they specifically say, like, well, yesterday, and then say what happened. So that all adds more ambiguity, and usually people say there's no punctuation in classical Chinese. The texts were transmitted without punctuation, but strangely in these bamboo strips they found there is some punctuation. But no one can quite figure out what exactly it does because there was historically no punctuation. So it's not, they're big, the punctuation seems to be larger than a sentence period. It's something more like a paragraph unit maybe, but it's not clear how it works. But there's not really much punctuation. And then the last thing is that characters can almost always be used as nouns or verbs. So you also don't know which part of speech the character is meant to be in. You just have to tell from context. And so the example I put here is it's a line from Confucius from the Analects that says, in Chinese it's fu fu ya. So the ya part just sort of links the two together. And it really is just saying father, father. Right? But it has to be the father is the noun and father, the second father is a verb. So it has to be something like father's father, right? Or fathers act like fathers, or something like that. You can say that in classical Chinese with almost any noun can be used as a verb. So this is another kind of place where ambiguity comes in. And we'll see that in chapter 1. There's a very famous, crucial case of this. It's not clear what's the noun and what's the verb. On the metaphorical roots of the characters, I gave an example here. That actually worked all right. Can anybody... These are all pictographic, but I don't think anybody who doesn't know Chinese could guess what that's supposed to be a picture of. Any guesses? So these are the actual like modern character forms. These are the ancient forms. Any idea?
Tree.
It is tree, but you knew it was tree, right?
I'm
You're not
sure.
guessing from the picture.
I forgot.
I was going to say tree or co-rank.
Oh, it's on the handout. That's right. I put the answers on the next slide.
It does look like a tree.
It looks kind of like a tree, yeah.
It's got roots.
This then you could probably guess.
Forest?
Yeah, it's forest.
Oh, yeah, 'cause
Um,
there's a lot.
These two are opposite terms, and from the pictograph, from the character, no one can ever guess it, but from the pictograph, you might be able to guess it. Probably not, though. But these two.
Woman and man.
No, so they're based off of the tree.
Oh.
Yeah, they look a little different from the tree, but they're all versions of the tree. So this one is the roots, and this part is a little bigger here, and this one is the branches marked up at the top. Right. So these characters literally mean root and branches. In general, they can just mean beginning and end. So they take a more abstract meaning of like beginning and end. But why I picked this part of it is because there's always a lingering sense of this natural metaphor there. So like in English, you don't necessarily know if the end is more important than the beginning, right? But in Chinese, the bun is always more important than the branches, right? Because the root is more fundamental than the branches. So if you can say something about the beginning and the end in a translation, but it loses this sense that the beginning is the root and the end is the outcome of the root, and the root's more fundamental, and usually even a sense that like the root will naturally lead to the results or will lead toward the branches. Right? And this is all kind of visible in the character itself, in that it's still like, if it's written as beginning, if it means beginning, it's still a picture of a tree with the root marked on it. You know what I mean? You can't avoid that original natural metaphor. I'll give you another example like that. Anyone guess any of these? This one I think is easier. Nobody?
The far right looks like a moon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Paired with the moon.
Sun
The
is
like-
sun.
The
And
sun. The
and-
sun.
Okay.
So this is the sun and this is the moon.
oh,
These are the modern character forms.
Those are identical in the West. That's the alchemical symbol for the sun, the circle with a dot, and the moon.
Yeah.
as the crescent.
Yeah. And then this character basically just puts them together. These are both really old original forms of the character, right? And there is clearly a sun and a moon together.
Is that like a day?
Well, this character has a lot of different meanings. So its core meaning is bright, like to shine, so to be bright, to be glowing.
Mm-hmm.
It also has a sense of to see clearly. So it sometimes has a sense of like insight or understanding or enlightenment. If you wanted to try to get the light metaphor in there, you could say something like enlightenment.
Illumination.
Illumination, right. But it often still has connotations coming from this original root with the sun and the moon. So one of those is, it's often linked to impartiality. And so it was a common sort of saying to talk about being impartial like the sun and the moon, which shine on all things equally. They don't evaluate anything, they just shine on everything equally. So this Ming sometimes has echoes of that kind of impartiality going back to Ming is this character here. So this brightness or this insight has some sense of impartiality often, like the sun and the moon. Right? So I think one question in reading these often is how much of that old etymological literal meaning is still intended, how much of it isn't, how to translate that, so some of them, you'll see some of the translators, Moss Roberts particularly, often tries to get at the literal roots of the characters, when he translates them. But most people ignore them, but it depends, on. Another example, I should have put it up here, I didn't think about it, is the character for simplicity also has the tree in it with a kind of a part that just gives you the pronunciation really, so it's the image of the tree, and it literally is uncarved wood. Right, so you can translate it as simplicity, that's what it really means, or you can translate it as uncarved wood or the simplicity of uncarved wood if you want to keep that like natural root metaphor to it, right? So the whole language is bound up with these kinds of natural metaphors. Sometimes some characters you can't see you can't understand how they were connected to the root metaphor and that kind of thing. But in lots of cases there is some sort of play, I think, on this original metaphor that's there.
So does spoken Chinese have anything to do with these characters at all?
There's a little bit of connection. So these ones that I gave up here are all just ideographic. A lot of them will be associated with a pronunciation. And so then sometimes the character will have like two parts, and one will link to the pronunciation and one will link to the image of the meaning of the character. So the one for uncarved wood is like that. It's got a tree and then a symbol that's associated with the sound pu or bu. And it gives you a rough sense of the sound.
So is that how someone from China would take a Western name and convert it into characters? Sort of from like whatever words sound like that in Chinese?
Yeah, right. And so it's in a way not that different from the way we would take a Chinese name and spell it out with the Roman alphabet. But because Chinese characters are all a syllable, you can't pronounce, that's the level you have to spell it on, right? So that's why it ends up being like, Frank might be Fu Lan Ke, right? So Fu Lan Ke would be sort of like Frank, that would be the closest you could get, but it's all on the level of syllables, so it doesn't get that close in the pronunciation.
It's the same thing when you transliterate a name into Hebrew.
Oh really? It's on the syllable level?
Yeah, because the letters aren't really letters, they're sounds. So I would be Aleph 12, let's see, Aleph 12, Yud, Aleph.
Yeah. Sometimes they'll try to connect it to the meaning of the name also, in transliterating stuff, or some play on it. So the famous example that I don't know exactly how to translate it is Coke, Coca-Cola. When that was translated, it was, what is it, Coca-Cola?
可口 is like something that's very like pleasing to the mouth, and then 可乐, I'm not sure, but 乐 is a symbol for happiness. It's a really brilliant translation.
Right, so the K would be like, can't be. like
Yeah, maybe.
can't
That
be
works.
happy, right?
So almost like a pun, in a sense, or implying, yeah.
Yeah, so it would be
Wow.
it's some attempt to, to link to the meaning of the name. It depends. Some people, it's people who have gotten Chinese names, sometimes they can combine it with something close to the sound of their name and some kind of meaning. Sometimes not,
Mhm.
That's all, I just want to clarify one thing. When these texts were written, if the person who wrote one of them, for some reason, was reciting that text, I mean, would it be as open to interpretation then as the written version?
I'm not sure, because I'm not sure how much. It would be more like in English, where the roots of the words are not visible. If you were just speaking in Chinese, you would have no idea that these had like tree imagery
Well, yeah, that's
and
what
that
I'm
kind of stuff.
kinda
Yeah,
getting at, I guess, because you wouldn't see the picture and
Right.
it's so broad of a possibility of interpretation.
yeah. No, that's an interesting point. I don't know how much, I assume, literacy rates, we don't know what they were, but were probably
Right.
pretty low. And so a lot of people would have been reciting the text without knowing what the characters would look like or
Right.
something like that,
But then I assume though they all knew what the words meant, or at least.
Yeah, right, so they
Some
might
kind
have
of-
known some of the etymology of the words or the sort of connotations of the words. I think part of the difficulty is even figuring out, like, so when they say simplicity, were they hearing simplicity or were they hearing uncarved wood?
Right.
Right, and there's no, I don't know if there's any way to figure that out, like what was the implications of those things when they said them.
I always got the impression that if because of the writing system, people of completely different dialects could still communicate with each other.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, and so, these, like, the characters would be known by somebody who read Japanese, would know all these characters as well, but they would pronounce them in a very different way. And
Mm-hmm.
Korean was given a phonetic alphabet quite a long time ago, but it was originally written with Chinese characters as well. Vietnamese also, aside from all the dialects within China, that would pronounce them differently, but the characters themselves are a kind of common framework, because they're not directly linked to the pronunciation.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it sounds like it's a very poetic language when spoken, so that maybe at that time they had spoken poetic meanings that were able to be translated back and forth so that you could connect the literal meaning with the symbolic meaning. Is it?
Yeah, what do you mean by the poetic?
Well, just a figurative speech. Like, let's say in
Yeah.
ancient Norse, a ship was like a seahorse. So you had these it wouldn't be alliterations, but that type of thing where something different for what was being said. Like
Right.
uncarved wood for what was it?
Simplicity.
Simplicity.
Yeah. Yeah, it might be, and actually part of going to Althea's point about the alchemical tradition and the sort of internal alchemy tradition would write like that a lot, right? And so that's where it's very difficult to know if a word is a kind of allusion to some other concept, or not.
And then maybe too, even the idea of how they thought of wood, all the different manifestations of it.
Yeah, that's another interesting one, is they use a lot of metaphors of plant growth, but like how did they think about that? Is not so easy to say,
I think though, just responding a little bit to what you're talking about, John, there is a difference in the sense that, so for example, when they're talking about the Magpie Bridge, or they're talking about, they're making an alchemical reference, those were actually quite fixed. If you were in the know, you knew. In the same way that if you're reading Norse poetry and you see seahorse, you know it means ship.
Right.
But then uncarved wood is more like the word in English natural, which can mean a lot of things. It can mean natural in the sense that it's uncorrected or unchanged nature. It could mean a manner of being. It has multiple nuance.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Right, there's probably some technical word for that kind of language where there's these set stand-ins for other concepts, you know, that's not making it really ambiguous if you know
Right.
what they mean. It's only ambiguous if you don't know what they mean. I think, yeah, with the way I would read the DaodeJing, it's not like that, right? These are metaphors, and how much how much of the metaphor is implied or not is the question. It's just kind of ambiguous, like using a metaphor would be.
So on the what's on the board right now?
Oh, I can give you the
Oh.
names of the characters.
Okay, so these are the old and the new, and the older version of the character is the one with the white background.
Yeah.
And I just find it interesting that the top line totally makes sense, and at least I can relate to it because there's a relationship there with the shape. The bottom part they're all, whether it's the moon or the sun, are dealing with things that have round shapes. Yet the characters are all squared off.
Yeah.
And the squared off characters is the new version, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of? I don't understand what happened there. Or with the relationship, how that works.
There is a historical answer to that, and I don't know what it is, but there was some. You don't draw hardly any circles in Chinese now. Like that's just not really a stroke that you use. So everything
there's no
is kind
smooth.
of no. So everything is kind of written within a box, and
Okay.
there's some curves and things, but there's no like circles. And I think that's connected to the writing technology that was being used when the characters were standardized. But I don't know exactly what.
I mean, like
what
because of
that
machinery that was being used, like the typeset stuff. Or?
No, it might be something with
Just
using
a brush.
The brush, the strokes, up, down,
Yeah.
as easier than trying to make circles or something like that.
Well, especially with running ink.
Well, I mean, like you could make the moon is just like two curved brush strokes, but they square that off completely.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly it was. So these, and I actually didn't keep careful track of. I have it written down, but where these were from. But these, I think all three of these are from oracle bones. So these would be carved on bones used for divination. They would be probably from 1200 BC, or around that time, or a little earlier, maybe a little later than that. Some of these are from bronze inscriptions, I think. So these ones would have been more like you would have written or would have been printed.
This happened like in this century, when they went to this the new version.
No, it's much older than that. It's possible it goes back to woodblock printing. So it could go back to printing methods. I'm not sure if it
like
goes
when
back
we got the
earlier
printing
than
press,
that.
Gutenberg. You talking about?
Yeah. Well, right, but in China, they had printing, sort of standardized printing much earlier. The woodblock texts are all squared characters, but I think it goes back even earlier than that, to when, back to the sort of Han Dynasty, but I'm not sure that.
Maybe it was easier to carve accurately, things more squared off than trying to have everybody be doing these shapes kind of thing.
More likely.
Yeah, I don't know. There was a standardization of the script when the Qin state conquered all the warring states and unified China. That was 221 BC. And it might have been from then, because now that I think about it, like the Han Dynasty bamboo strips are already squared characters, so that's, from, say, 100 BC at least, it's already squared off.
And they're on the same time, so in our timeline, that would still be like 2,100 years ago or whatever?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So I thought I would start with chapter 40, which is actually relatively simple, and that's the one I gave a handout last time. I don't know if anybody looked at it, but that has all the characters and the meanings for it. And I said if you wanted to try to figure it out some, you could look through that handout. So I picked it for that because it's relatively short, right? So returning is the movement of the Tao, weakness is the function of the Tao. It could be the use of the Tao, would be just as easy to do it that way. The things of the world are born from being, being is born from non-being, or something like that. The main issue here really is the question of sort of the nuances of how to translate being and non-being, right? So I put a little list here of different ways people have translated it: existence and non-existence, being and not being, or no being or non-being, being and nothing. Those are all fairly similar, and then presence and non-presence, determinate and indeterminate, becoming and negation. What's interesting is, to me, those have very different connotations, right? Especially say determinate and indeterminate compared to being and non-being, or existence and non-existence. For one thing, like the language of being and existence all sounds very, I don't know, abstract and metaphysical and very heavy, right? Whereas the determinate, indeterminate, presence, non-presence seem much more concrete, right? They seem much less built into like a big metaphysical picture of the world or something like that. The other crucial difference is whether wu, that first, the term translated as non-being, really means like nothing at all. And it seems like it doesn't mean that. I think I mentioned this last time. It's hard to get a sense of what it means exactly, but there is one text that talks about qi and some other something, spatiality or something, existing before there is yo, being, right? But they exist. So it's the contrast between, so it sounds like on the first translations, it's linking to like the classic Western question of how do you get something from nothing, right? And this is about getting something from nothing. But that doesn't seem to be what they're talking about, because it seems more to be like Ames and Hall translated, how do you get something concrete from something that's not itself concrete, right? Or how do you get, well, I think that's probably the best way to interpret it really, is how do you get concrete things out of some broader unity that's not itself a concrete thing, you know? But you can see just how different sounding the different translations are in their connotations, you know, and it's really an issue just of translation. The Chinese, it's just wu and yo, right? So you don't have to figure out how to map it onto an English term. But you find this with a lot of terms, and we'll look at some examples of Dao as well, how to translate that gets into these different sort of connotations. The only textual issue with this is from one of the earliest excavated texts, what I've called the Daodjing bamboo strips from 300 BC. Because that has the line in a slightly different way. It's missing, so this is, right, the character yo, that's being, right? So this is the things of the world are born from or generated from being. Being is born or generated from non-being. But the Daodjing one leaves out this second being, right? So it really just says things of the world are born from being, born from non-being. So that's a big difference, right? Because then it's no longer saying there's a progression from things to being to non-being. It really is saying things emerge from both being and non-being together. There's some support for that other places in the Laozi. So chapter 2 says that being and non-being give birth to each other or generate each other. That makes it sound like they're both like mutually implicated, like all opposites are in the DaodeJing. If you have one side of an opposition, you have the other side implicated with it. It's not clear though if this could be, the Daodjing could be a mistake. You know, that's what lots of people say, and it should be like it's always been read, that it's a progression from things to being to non-being. So it's not clear. When they would repeat characters on these bamboo strips, they wouldn't write the character twice. They would write the character and then put what looks kind of like an equal sign after it, to mark like that should just be the repeated character. And so it would be easy to forget the little equal sign, you know. And then he would get this version. But anyway, it is an interesting variation, you know.
But these bamboo strips are clearly before Buddhism made it into China though, right?
Yeah, right. Definitely before Buddhism made it in.
Because this implies non-dualism.
But I think the Chinese view was non-dualistic also from the beginning. That's not a Buddhist influence, I think.
Ah.
Yeah. Actually, when Buddhism came in, they often had a hard time explaining what Buddhism was rejecting. You know, I mean, they couldn't figure out what the opponent of Buddhism was often because they didn't have that in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the early Buddhist translations into Chinese are really strange because they're criticizing positions that you almost can't even say them in Chinese, you know, because they're just foreign to the Chinese view. Nothing were you
I was just thinking about that, the Daodjing. That makes sense if you think about being and non-being as being like the Tao, which, because yin is associated with being and substantiality, and yang is associated with non-being, with the etheric. So that would make total sense that all things are born from both in the interaction and the mutual interdependence of them.
Yeah, and I think that there's a kind of tension in the DaodeJing at best a tension, right? Because there is this line is undeniable, that it says being and non-being generate each other.
Right, which is straight out
So
Chinese
most people would say,
medicine.
well, it's using them
Yeah.
in different senses. So there it's talking about like the words depend on each other. And in this chapter, it's really talking about the things themselves, and they don't depend on each other. Being is, non-being is primary to being. Right, so they usually say, well, it's being used in different ways, but I think you gotta be suspicious when you're saying, well, the words are being used in different ways, you know?
Right.
So,
Well, but again, I mean, the logic that underlies the whole notion of yin and yang, which emerges actually out of the Tao, which is something else entirely, you know, being and non-being do generate all things, and it's the dynamic polarity between the two.
I think that's the
That's the
question though,
body-mind
actually
complex.
though, is whether non-being here is the Tao
Mm-hmm.
or not. Right, I think that's the question. So I lean toward thinking non-being is the Tao,
Right.
in which case it's not being in, I mean the Tao isn't like a yin-yang polarity. There's not the Tao and something else that together generate things.
Well, the Tao emerges from the void, though. That's what they say in alchemy. That the Tao
Yeah.
is not the ultimate. There is something beyond the Tao, which
Really?
is the void.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because I think part of what's going on with this passage is you started to have people trying to say, like, what's the ultimate foundation of things? What's the ultimate ground of things, right? So thinking about this question of origins and what sort of connects things. And it seems like the first answer was something like the oneness, or being, right? So you have distinct things and then there's something like one that holds them all together. And I think what you see in the DaodeJing is a critique of that, saying like, no, that's too concrete already to talk about the one.
Right.
We're talking about something that isn't even a thing. It's not even a being.
Right.
And you can't name it, you can't say what it is, you can only kind of gesture toward it in different ways, right? But what happens over time is that Tao starts to become more like the one, in
One.
the sense that people start to think, well, you've now named the ultimate reality and it's Tao. And so it makes sense that you would have a further critique that would say, no, it's not Tao, there's something more
Right.
negative, more void than Tao.
Right.
Almost like the same movement, like Tao comes in, I think, to try to say there's something more fundamental than the one.
Exactly.
Right.
And there's the same parallel it occurs in the West in Kabbalah, which is exactly the same.
Yeah.
You have the primordial unity out of which comes that first yin-yang polarity, but that isn't, that the one is actually, there is what is behind the one, which is, they just call the unlimited.
Well, that kind of supports your idea, and whoever else is on board with it, that it was a progression of different people that constructed it. 'Cause it's like, maybe like one guy did one chunk, and then another guy came along and said, that doesn't quite nail this jello to the wall. We got to add these things to it, because every chapter ultimately, right, is about the precept of every chapter is that they're trying to describe the Tao, right? I mean, every single one is like they're talking about the Tao in a different, angle or something.
Yeah, that is my view of the DaodeJing, is that it's written by different people and that there's debates going on within it. But what's more clear is that the DaodeJing was debating with other people making similar claims, and so this is part of these other texts that they found. You find some of these other claims that were being made, and particularly about the one. There's these statements about the one that the DaodeJing seems to be criticizing. I think last time I don't think I have it actually in here again, but famous line from the DaodeJing that says the Tao generates one generates two generates three. They found a text that just says one generates two generates three, and then goes on from there. So it's too similar to be a coincidence, like they were in dialogue, and it seems like, well, there was an idea, like there's the one, it generates two, that generates three, and then everything follows. And whoever's writing the DaodeJing is saying, like, well, that's true, but before that, there's Tao before that, And I kind of think the non-being is working the same way here, like to say, look, there's something more primordial even than being, right? There's this non-being, this void or something like that. So I think that's mainly what I want to say about this chapter. The other thing I would mention about this beginning part, which the translations that we looked at are, they vary some, but they roughly mean the same. It's not really big differences on it. But it is, I think, saying that the activity of the Tao is not negative, but it's not forceful in the world, right? So return is always actually a kind of backward movement. That's the movement of the Tao. Its function or its use, the way you use it, the way it works in the world is through softness, through weakness. And I think, I mean, if these are actually connected together originally, there must be some sense that it's the very sort of negativity of the Tao, right, that keeps it from being forceful in the world, directing the world in certain ways. It works in a way that's always kind of like the non-being, right? It's always sort of drawing things back, always the yielding element in things. So I think, you know, it's possible that these are just two separate lines that got put together in one chapter, but assuming that it's all was put together, like written as a whole, that would seem to be the connection, right? Is that this weakness, this returning, is somehow connected to the ultimate being, non-being or lack or non-presence.
Could returning also be looked at though as cyclicity?
Yeah, I think that's I think it has a sense partly of the cycles of the seasons and all of that.
Right.
And then a sense also of things coming out from the source and going back into the source. So
Right.
things take concrete form and then they lose concrete form. And that losing concrete form is not total non-existence or something like that, right? It's really just being back into the indefinite and back into the indeterminate.
A state change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I'll say something about chapter 1. It has, I think, the most interesting variations and the most important variations. Right, and it's probably the most famous past chapter of the DaodeJing. Right, so this is my translations here are kind of rough, so they're a little rough, but this would be my best attempt at it. A way that can be followed is a way is not a constant way. A name that can be named is not a constant name. Nameless is the beginning of the myriad things. The named is the mother of the myriad things. Thus always be desireless to see its mysteries, always have desires to see its boundaries. These two emerge the same, they differ in name, but their sameness is profound and obscure, profound and more profound, the gate of the mass of mysteries. So there's a number of real difficulties with this chapter, with how to translate it. And one is, again, on the nuances of the classical Chinese terms, you know. And so I'll talk some about Tao, how to translate that. But there are other examples. So this one I translate as profound and obscure. Its core, etymologically, its meaning is black thread. It has a sense of blackness or darkness. It's very hard to figure out how to translate it. That's why I used actually two words to translate it, because it has a sense of being not visible, but also of being somehow like deep. You know, it's very hard to figure out how to translate that. So that's, the translations vary a lot on how to do that particular word. The word for mysteries is kind of the same way. So the word for mysteries is actually a picture of a woman next to a character that means few, but I think it gives the pronunciation there actually. So it's a picture of a woman, but the etymology of it is not really known, like how that came about, you know, what the real origin is. There's a related character that might be the original form that's not a woman, but it's an I. So it's not clear what the origins are. I think Moss Roberts translates it though, somehow getting the feminine aspect into the translation of it. But it's very hard to figure out how to translate that. Those are examples of the difficult ones to translate. The one for its boundaries also is very not clear what that character means even, so those vary a lot in the translations.
Was profound the black thread, or what was
The black thread I did as profound and obscure together in the first line, and then just as profound in the second line. So then with the obvious problem of Tao. So I gave this slide before, right? So Tao means a path, to go along a path, to guide a path. So the question is, how do you convey it in English? One possibility is just to leave it untranslated, which is the safest thing to do, right? And figure people will kind of put together a meaning over time as you read it. Another possibility is to translate it as path or way, which is its literal meaning, right? So it's that I think is the best way to translate it, because it's getting its literal meaning and you're not adding your idea of what the Tao ultimately is or something. But I think translators feel like they want to explain more of what the Tao really is, you know, and path doesn't really get to what, like how could a path be the ultimate origin of things? That doesn't really make sense, right? It's clearly not an adequate label if you just use path. So most translators nowadays just use Tao or path, but in older translations you find some attempt to explain what the Tao really means. Ames and Hall translated always as way making rather than way. To try this is a contemporary translation to try to emphasize a kind of dynamic element to it, that it's not just something that we sort of passively follow or something like that, but we're always involved in making the Tao when we act on the Tao. So they always translate it that way. I put here some of the earliest translations though. So the first translation really, the Tao, and then he says, reason, which can be Daod, reasoned, is not the eternal Tao. Reason with a capital R, right? If you think about it, like, it's really hard to see how you could read Tao as reason, because it seems like the whole text is questioning rationality and those kinds of things. But I think the idea is it's like his idea must be that it's like the rational order of things, which again I think is not what it is, right? But it's 1868, right? And he's the first one trying to translate it.
It's funny, I don't think Chalmers had access to the 1788 Jesuit translation into Latin, but it's translated ratio.
Oh. Okay, that's where it comes from then, is the Latin translation.
Yeah, but Chalmers, I don't think he had access to it. I'm not sure. I can look into that.
Well, there was an early French translation, I thought it was Julien's that you gave me, but it's not, that translates Tao as logos.
Well, that would make sense.
And that makes some sense,
Yeah.
actually, but I thought maybe this reason was some development out of the translation of it as logos, maybe.
Because logos implies, in the Hermetic sense, it implies much more than, it's the creative word. It's the explosion outward, it's the Big Bang, it's...
Right, well, yeah, it nicely captures, Tao can mean to speak or to explain something.
Right.
So it captures this sense of like a kind of order and a kind of way that it could be spoken.
Right.
So I think, it's nobody translates it that way now, but there was some 19th century translation that did it as logos, I think. Balfour, which I think is the second translation, right, does Tao, or principle of nature, which is fair enough as an explanation of what Tao is, I think. 1895, though, you get this idea that Tao is God, right? So this Alexander translates it as God, and then puts in parentheses, the great everlasting infinite first cause from whom all things in heaven and earth proceed.
That's very deep.
Yeah, it's interesting, and this is, Andrew actually gave me these citations, but of debates about how much the Tao can be equated with God or not, and people saying it is God, and then others, disputing that. But now, I don't think anyone would want to translate Tao as God, but I think it's partly where you see these biases come in, right? So, these are people who, the funny thing is, I bet that you could split these early translations, that people who were skeptical of God don't want to translate it as God, and people who believe in God want to translate it as God. I would bet that they play out roughly that way. Not always, though. James Legge was a missionary, and he doesn't translate it as God, right? But still, there's these biases toward what you wanted to confirm your views, you wanted to be appealing to people who are your audience. This is 1895, right? Translating it as God. But then you can also see in these, like, their range of concepts they can use to interpret it is kind of limited, So, reason, God, providence, those are all really problematic as translations of Tao. But that was the conceptual framework they were kind of working with, and so they're trying to find which of these concepts best fits with it. I think now our thinking has changed a lot, but also over time we can get more like, well, now Tao is practically an English word. Like, if people know roughly what it means, and we have much more knowledge of what that could mean. We have a kind of bigger repertoire of concepts maybe to try to make sense of it.
Going back to the logos thing though, when you look at the chapter 1, then you have the second line you have about naming, and then you have nameless and the named being the mother of the myriad things. So I think that's probably where the logos notion comes from, because the named meaning, there's that whole magical concept of to name a thing is to have power over it, or to create it, or to bring it into being.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It might be. I wanted to check those early French translations.
Yeah.
When I used to read these over and over again, I always kind of just thought that the Tao was like a conflation of all those things. It had a little bit of element of God in it. It had a little bit of element of way. It had a little bit of element of like the Western poetic idea that the journey is the thing, not the destination. You know that's why they spent. That's why they held on to these different chapters to kind of like show the different faces of the Tao, if you will.
Yeah, and I think
couldn't that be?
this is partly why, if you think about them translating it, well, the Tao is the ultimate in this system, right? So if in your view God is a way of labeling the ultimate, then you could see why someone would want to call it God, right? But the problem is that implies so many other things that aren't implied by Tao, right? But it does have this element. I mean, you could say in this Taoist system, it plays the role that God plays as the sort of ultimate explanation, the final ground for things. But it's still really different from the idea of God, But it still has elements of all these different things. This is partly why, as the sort of...
I don't see it as the glue so much. Like a lot of people think glue is like the decider, the ultimate, supreme leader kind of, mentality thing. But but the Tao being more like the glue, the thing that holds everything kind of together, in a very, kind of passive way, not aggressive, not direct, but like kind of like in the background, just like it's just there.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's one possible way to look at it. There's a lot of different ways. So, the relation between the Tao and concrete things is one of the difficult things to sort out, and exactly that relationship. But I think this chapter actually has something to say about it. So a couple of other just kind of like the details, where these ambiguities come from. I put here a breakdown of the first line. So the first line uses Tao 3 times, right? The first time as a noun, the last time as a noun, the second time as a verb. And there's only 3 other characters. So ka, the second one, means can be, and it's followed by a verb in passive tense. So, can be seen, you would use ka. Anything like that. So that means the second Tao has to be a verb. This is part of the difficulty of translating it, is that you have to have something that can be a noun or a verb. And name happens to work well that way. A name that can be named works fine, but a path that can be... You're tempted to not use proper English, right? And say a path that can be pathed is not a constant path or something like that. I did it as a way that can be followed as a way. But you lose then the sort of beautiful simplicity of the Chinese, that it really is a Tao that can be Tao is not a constant Tao, and a name that can be named is not a constant name. So then the fei just means not. And then Chang is again one of these questions where its rough meaning is clear, but the nuances of how you translate it change it a lot. So to me, like constant and regular, already there's some difference there, because regular, I think, allows for some more variation, right? So something that's regularly so isn't always so, right? Eternal seems to me to have completely different connotations from regular or constant, So that's another place where these nuances of the English sort of, give a very different impression, I think, from the translation. The other interesting thing to keep in mind is, as I said, there's no singular or plural marked in Chinese. There's no articles. And so that first line could really be completely grammatically plausibly read to say any of these 3 things, right? So it could be a Tao that can be Tao that is not the eternal Tao. So there is the eternal Tao, and it cannot be followed as a Tao. It cannot be Tao, right? So any Tao that could be Taoed, that's not what we're talking about here. That's not the eternal Tao. That's the most common way to read the passage, right? But it could just as well be the Tao can be Taoed, but it is not a constant Tao, right? On that line, you would be saying the Tao we're talking about is not constant, right? It's something that you can follow it in concrete ways, but it's never the same, it's never constant, right? It's almost the exact opposite of the first meaning, right? Which says anything that you could actually follow as a way, anything that could actually be a way, that's not the constant, that's not the eternal Tao. The second way almost is saying the opposite, like, no, the Tao, you can follow it, but then it's never constant, right? And this one is in a way even more different, right? Because it could be plurals, I don't know if I should have added an apostrophe to make Dao plural, but Daos can be Daoed, but they're not constant Daos. So you would say something like, paths can be followed as paths, but they're not constant paths. That's completely plausible as a translation as well, because you don't know if it's singular or plural, you don't know what the articles are or anything like that. You know? It would seem almost shocking, I think, to say that it's not contrasting the Tao that can be followed and the eternal Tao. But it makes some sense in the DaodeJing, because the idea would be that you can get guidance from the Tao. That's the whole point, is to get guidance from the Tao. But it's never constant, because every situation is different. And so what that's going to tell you to do in a situation is always going to be different depending on the situation. So it's plausible that that's what it's saying, and it's not really a big metaphysical claim about the eternal Tao. It really is just saying, insofar as you follow the Tao, it will never be constant.
Has this any, it reminds me a lot of quantum physics. Is it one influenced the other, or, because it just sounds a lot like it to me.
They didn't influence each other, but I think people have made that connection from pretty early on.
Yeah, I mean,
you
if
know.
you measure it, it's changed right away.
Yeah.
So that's what it seems to me.
There's even that book, isn't it? The Tao of Physics?
Yes,
Yeah.
Right.
good job, Prof.
Right. Yeah.
Even the act of observing it changes it.
Right.
There's no pops pass about the
Right, well, that's why I think the second line makes more sense, because first of all, how do you talk about an eternal Tao? The Tao is constantly transforming itself, it's the nature
Yeah.
of it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I like the second reading of it, but it's if you really on grammatical terms alone, you really could be any of those three. I think. Yeah.
What about the translation of the second Tao that renders it as like spoken or said?
That's the most common way to translate it, is when to move from Tao as a noun, use it as like path or way, and then when it's used as a verb, to use it as to say or speak. And that's actually not a very common meaning for Tao in classical Chinese, to say or to speak. It can mean that, but it's not very common. But I think that loses, I don't think it has in mind two different concepts, Tao and speaking. And it just happens to use the same character for both of those meanings. I think it's more sophisticated than that. And especially the parallel line uses name. Name that can be named is not a constant name, or names can be named, but they're not constant names, right? And so I think that it really is a common, all three of the Tao uses here are mean Tao, follow as a way or be a way or something like that. But yeah, it's kind of sad, I think, that the translations often lose the kind of compact play on words by just translating the second Tao as speak.
Why
And then
would
you
you
lose
translate it as speak when the character has a foot in it? Shouldn't it be walked or trod or?
Yeah, I think it should be, but it can. But Tao doesn't in this time period in classical Chinese, it really doesn't mean to speak, but it can mean to sort of explain your way. That seems to be the origins of the speaking meaning. Seems to be I can explain to you the way to do something, and that could be Tao as a verb.
Okay.
This old book that we talked about before says told, uses told.
Told. Yeah. Right. So I think that's missing the meaning of the passage to translate it that way. But it's a very common translation.
I think trod would be better.
Yeah, I like trot better. Yeah. Oh.
I keep looking at it though and going, it's like consciousness. It's like the eye, the foot. It's like being conscious, being grounded, being between two paths, trying to find the way of consciousness between alternate realities, and being
Yeah.
grounded in yourself somehow, and that being perhaps the path.
I think that in this context, it would be, the emphasis wouldn't be so much on consciousness or not consciousness as much as sort of, I don't know how to put it, following, I want to say following along a path, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in, say, the Zhuangzi, the examples they give are often of doing skills, right? Where there's a story of a butcher who's cutting up an ox, but other things like that, that sort of the ideal is to be absorbed in the moment and just responding to the moment. And you could say it's conscious, but it's not self-conscious. Like you lose the self, you know, and you're just kind of following along with what the moment is bringing to you. And that seems to be part of the idea of wu wei, of non-action, those kinds of things, is at least not a kind of self-consciousness, you know, so a kind of awareness, I would want to say, but not a kind of, not so much of a subject-object division, you might say, so a kind of absorption into the world. Although just from these lines, it's hard to say, you know, exactly what's going on with it. But on the broader context, I think the biggest dispute about these chapters is in the next lines, right? So I put here the four translations I handed out. Non-existence is named the antecedent of heaven and earth, and existence is named the mother of all things. Absent is the name for sky and land's first life, present for the mother of the 10,000 things. So Roberts is translating this wu as absent instead of non-existence, and then present as being, the word for that would be translated as being other places as present, right? These are translations of the same line, though, right? So D.C. Lau has the nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth, the name was the mother of the myriad creatures. Henrik says the nameless is the beginning of the 10,000 things, the name is the mother of the 10,000 things. So you can see this kind of radical difference in the meaning of the lines, whether the subject is absence or non-being, or non-existence, in existence, or whether it's nameless and the named. Right? So this is a kind of famous dispute about how to read the first chapters. I think it's also worth noting, again, the way the nuances come into these different translations. So Roberts translates heaven and earth as sky and land, which sounds a lot different from heaven and earth to me. Like heaven and earth sounds much more sort of theological to me and heavy than sky and land. Both translations are legitimate. You know, I don't know how you would distinguish them, but I feel like the connotations are very different, and I think Roberts is deliberately trying to not use such kind of what might sound like religious language or something.
But heaven and earth is the primal polarity. It's yin and yang. It comes out of the Tao. In Chinese medicine, you see that over and over and over again. Man is what stands between heaven and earth. Heaven and earth is heaven is yang, earth is yin.
Yeah.
And that proceeds out of the Tao.
Right, but if you said all of that, but instead of heaven and earth you said sky and land.
Right. Well.
Right. I mean, so because
it's not the same. I don't think.
The English is not the same, right?
Right.
Yeah, the connotations aren't the same.
No, I mean, because by heaven they don't just mean sky. It implies the entire immaterial world of chi or energy or
Yeah.
yeah, and earth doesn't imply just the planet Earth. It implies matter, substantiality, yin.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
isn't the problem there, her interpretation of it may have, in Chinese medicine, may have been derived from one school of thought on what this book means.
Yeah, right. Or
You
one
see-
thread that
Yeah.
was even among the authors of the book. You know, it's hard to say. You know, this. I mean, I guess that's one of the underlying things, right? That splits readings of the book, and all of classical Chinese stuff is. It's not quite to say a kind of religiousness versus a non-naturalistic view.
Right.
But it's something like that, right? And so Roberts is clearly trying to push a kind of naturalistic view. You see in the Ames et Hall translation, instead of translating heaven as heaven, he translates it as heavens, right?
Which would also
Meaning like the heavens. And that's a way to make it very naturalistic sounding. Or he translates it as nature sometimes even, right? And that sounds really different from if you translate it as heaven with a capital H, you
Well,
know?
but see again, when the Chinese were talking about heaven, though, and it often was heavens, because it was kind of like Dante. There were many layers in the Taoist cosmogony, but you know, they don't mean heaven like you can't transliterate that to the Western heaven, which is about being rewarded and all that stuff.
Right.
They didn't mean that at all.
Right. Yeah, it's in a way it's a terrible translation,
Right,
translated
right.
as heaven, because it has that misleading sense of like the place good people would go when you died. It doesn't have that sense at all.
Right.
I think the reason why that stuck is because that word did refer to like the divine,
Right.
and it also does mean the sky. It is the word you would use for the sky. And so heaven has some sense of that overlap, and I think that's how that word caught on as a translation
Yeah.
for this word tian, that it's translating.
You know, one of the other interesting things about that whole idea of heaven and earth is, I don't know if you're familiar with George Lakoff's work at all.
little bit.
He's the cognitive linguist, and he talks about how a lot of our values and things come out of our existence in the world, and that when we are using metaphors like things like up is good, down is bad, and somebody who's up and about is better than he's down. They could be injured, they could be ill, and so you get the same kind of feeling. Heaven is looking up, majesty, that sense of things being above you and being more powerful, possibly from being a child and having parents above. So there's this feeling of value too, or at least polarity with heaven and earth, something extraordinary, powerful above in our common, just in our existence, and then earth being more common, we are on the earth and that sort of thing. So there's some interesting things to say about our neurology and our experience in the world and how that can be projected onto these metaphors and the words.
Yeah, I think that the only thing I would add to that, right, is that a lot of that stuff seems plausible to me about how ideas originally take form, right? Mm-hmm. But then they get taken up in sort of more conscious ways. And so one thing that DaodeJing is definitely doing is making heaven much less privileged, because before this you definitely have heaven as the highest, and they don't even talk about earth very much. And what you find really kind of first in the DaodeJing and these excavated texts that were with the DaodeJing is this pairing of heaven and earth, and it's very clearly meant to disrupt the whole focus on heaven before and say, heaven is only part of this duality.
Right.
So there's a way in which there I think is something natural about worshiping something up above you, but at some point people start, that gets critiqued, and then there's this sense that this gets
So
inverted.
it's interesting.
And that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
this could be a reaction to that. Somebody going, well, wait a minute, we're only thinking about it one way.
I think,
Yeah, it is.
again, you've got to look at it in the context of a dynamic duality. Or because heaven and earth, it's the yin and the yang. It's the insubstantial and the substantial. The one proceeds from the other, and the other is produced by. That's where that mothering thing is.
And,
Yeah.
but there-
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I'm.
Screwing up.
Well, pretty much my only context to put any of this in is from my first, well, not my first, but probably the grandest of my Tai Chi teachers. He was very powerful, and he had a very strong way of actually, manipulating a person's and a situation's electromagnetism. Like he could go like this and make everybody in the room sway back. But these things, these powers that he has, proceed from these deep understandings, and I think the problem with the word heaven is our problem with the word heaven.
Not theirs.
Not the
Right.
the fact that there is a heaven, and he always seemed to come to describe it as an uncontained container, that of which we are a part of, and in the earthiness of what can be experienced is a polarity. It is a polarity. It's the difference between the substantial and the insubstantial. And in terms of like when he would go into these deeper teachings to then start to give, for lack of a better word, techniques to extract, why is it important for you to understand it this way, is because you can extract effects by understanding it in this way. So there's this huge, multi-dimensional cosmology, and they understood things. They understood things, as, according to Wei-Sin Liao, about multiple galaxies and stuff, and understood the dynamics of what he would call these galactic winds, these solar winds,
Right.
and they could predict when they were coming around, and when what was your personal window of opportunity to then latch on to these flowing, what else could I say, energies, For lack of the cheese, he would
Yeah.
always say the cheese, these cheese, and even the cheese had qualities.
Mm-hmm.
So to name heaven is existence in general, creation and existence in general. And then to name earth was something that we could relate to on a three-dimensional level, which is very base. But it doesn't matter, and the other thing, and I'll say it and I'll shut up, is he made a big point all the time that there was not really meant to be all of this judgment around any of it. Whether what was grander or what was hierarchical, which was better than one or the other, it just was. And just
Right.
like electromagnetism just is. You can't have movement, you can't have, process without having the polarities, the positive and that. You need them both, and you need the neutral place, which he made a big deal about it being the strongest place.
Right.
There's something inherent about Western language that wants to make everything good or bad, kind of put it in those contexts. Like when you think of positive or negative, we don't. The average person, today, even though how I think, I still intrinsically go to thinking positive good, negative bad. But really, you think of it in terms of energy or Taoism. They're just opposite sides of a joining coin kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we do have that in the West. It's called Hermeticism. It's non-dualistic, but the problem is we've been like mired in this dualistic religious trend for the last 2,000 years.
And probably a lot of the Western people, right,
Yeah.
that were struggling translating this, had that, in their heads, and that's how they ended up getting, caught up with a lot of that, trying to translate the Chinese put it into that, paradigm, and it just doesn't, fit.
Yeah, and a little bit of it's just inherent in problems of translating anything, right? So the conjunction of concepts in Chinese is not, it doesn't correspond to anything in English or Western languages, because there really is a way in which that same word tian, it does mean something close to nature in places. It means a god in some places. It means this polarity with earth in places. And if you're writing in Chinese, you don't have to say which of those it is. You know what I mean? It binds all those meanings together. But if you put it into English, we just don't have that conjunction of concepts under one. We don't have one concept that combines all those things together. And so then you have to switch. And it's really like this book I was writing, kind of broadly studying all of the early Chinese philosophy. It's really hard to deal with because the meanings of the words, like new nuances come out with a new philosopher. But it's a big, to me, it's a problem if you switch from, like, in one, you're talking about heaven, and the next one you're talking about nature, and it's the same word, and they all knew it was the same word, and you lose that continuity, but you can't bridge it really in English very well, unless you just, you can just keep using the Chinese term, but that gets confusing also.
Would the ancient Chinese be something like a concept of wholeness? And then English with more influenced by reductionist thinking, that we have a dichotomy in that way to be able to kind of grasp the fullness of what's being presented?
Yeah, I think that's, as a generalization, that's right. And maybe a more direct way to put it would be that there's been something, fundamentally dualistic about Western thought from very early, even, pre-Christian, the division between the unchanging and the changing and the, all that kind of stuff that you have.
Most of it
And then
traced
mind
back
and
to
body.
Zoroaster. Yeah.
Another thing that I was thinking at that time too is, would it possibly be that you had a learned class writing these, DaodeJing, and the rest of the common people weren't on that wavelength at all, or was it all an integrated society, or was there anywhere?
No, and that's one thing I wanted to emphasize with some of the comments people are making is that we have to keep in mind that, like, at almost any given time, but especially at this time that this text was written, there were as many different kinds of Chinese philosophy as there were Western philosophy at any given time, and so, things people are saying, or what I'm talking about with this text, are true of some things and not other things. So even the positive negative, Well, I mean, yin and yang are not always equally balanced. Like, if you look at sort of Han Dynasty Confucians, yin and yang need each other, but it's clear that yang is better than yin. You know, and
I
it's
didn't
part of
know
the
that.
male dominance over the feminine and all those kinds of things. Like, that's a very strong thread of Chinese philosophy. Enough that you have, you know, sort of contemporary Chinese scholars interested in feminism critiquing the idea of yin and yang as always making women inferior to men because yang is always the lead on yin. Well, that isn't the case in the DaodeJing at all, right? And it's not the case in a lot of the Taoist texts, but it is the case in some Confucian texts. So you can't fully generalize about it, you know, and that's the thing with the role of heaven also. So lots of systems give heaven a big priority over earth. I don't think the DaodeJing does, but in fact, when, you know, the one passage that lays it out says human beings follow the earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows the Tao, Tao sort of follows what is so of itself, spontaneously so. So there's still a kind of implicit priority of heaven in the sense that earth follows heaven, you know. But I think overall it's moving toward a kind of balance between the two. That's connected to its context, which is trying to disrupt an idea of heaven as a kind of God who punishes bad people and rewards good people, and is the whole story. And it's really trying to say, no, that's, you know, that's sort of one polarity. But actually, the most radical claims are in two of these other texts that were found, like that have a kind of similar viewpoint. One of them says, we talk about heaven, but that's just chi. But I think chi there means air. And we talk about earth, but that's just dirt. And it's almost comparable to the, I forget which Greek philosopher said that the sun is a stone and not a god. It's comparable to that, to say like these things, we talk about them like they're gods and they're sacred, but it's just a way of talking about the air above us and the dirt below us. Now that was a minority viewpoint, I think, right? But you do have people saying that, you know, around this time. And so you have a kind of all different range of views, you know. And only a small a part of it really has been translated and sort of is accessible, you know, and that kind of stuff, I think, you know, is a problem with the diversity of views that were going on there at the time. Let me say a little bit about this distinction and how what's at the basis of it, and get at least through chapter 1 today. I said before that there's not really punctuation in the original, right? And so it's really a question of, it's really two things, the punctuation and what's a noun and what's a verb, right? So the two ways of punctuating it are to say, this is the word for non-being, right? This is the word for name. So non-being could be the subject, and then name is a verb. So it would be non-being names the beginning of the myriad things. Or you could take it as non-being could mean without, or to lack, or not have, and then ming would be, name would be a noun, and it would be lacking a name, the without name is the beginning of the myriad things. Right? So it depends on what you take as the subject and where you divide it and what's the noun and what's the verb. And then you have the exact same issue in the next set of lines about desire. Right? So one way to put it, so the first character here means constantly. So it could be constantly have non-being if you desire to see its mysteries. Right? Or it could be constantly be without desires in order to see its mysteries. Right? There's grammatically no way to settle it, you know, from the transmitted text. You know, it could be either way. By context, you know, by the overall meaning, everybody has their argument about what it should be. The Mao Dui text that they found, one of the things it has is a lot more grammatical markers in it. And that seems to kind of settle it for the second set of choices here, without name and without desired, rather than about non-being. And without getting too much detail, this character that I put in red always marks two noun phrases commenting on each other. So it's not a verb phrase, it's two nouns, and then its work functions basically like is. So then it would have to mean the nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. Constantly without desires, in order to see its mystery. So it seems to kind of settle it for this reading. Not totally decisively, but pretty decisively.
How old is that text? Is that the silk one?
That's the silk one, so that's 198 BC.
So it's about 100 years older than the bamboo one, or 100 years younger or
later,
something.
right? But the bamboo one, they don't have this one. It's not in it.
Mhm.
So the bamboo one has
Oh.
only about a third of the text, and it doesn't have the first chapter. So this is the earliest version that we have of the first chapter.
Mm.
But so that's one of the biggest divergences, I think, in how they translate it. One last interesting one is about the desire part, right? So is it saying that these are two ways of encountering the world? With desires, you see the mysteries. Without desires, you see the boundaries. Or is it really ranking them and saying, you know, without desires, you see the mysteries, but with desires, you only can see the boundaries or the concrete form or something? So this Henrik's adds only, but there's no only in the original, right? He adds that because he thinks there's really a kind of hierarchy of ways of experiencing things, but that's really his added interpretation. And you see it in lots of translations. Someone will add like only or add merely, right? To sort of depreciate the second kind of way of experiencing. And that might be implicit in the original, you know, but it's not, there's nothing in there that says that. The lines are actually exactly parallel to each other, you know. So it's another place where people sort of, their interpretation starts to creep into the translation, you could say, you know.
Would you say from your how you feel about the Tao the teachings that a statement like that is that the Tao or those that write of it they're not picking one side or the other, they're actually kind of saying, hey, you know, both are correct, they're presenting them equally? What do you think?
You know, I actually think that there's no way to know whether there was, what kind of priority there was between it. The fact is, I like better the view that these are two legitimate ways of experiencing the world, and
Right.
you want to have both.
I
I go
mean-
for that reading, but not really for any grammatical reasons, just because I like that view better.
In
you
old
know?
Chinese writing, it's not like what you put first has priority over what comes second, is there? There's no...
No,
like
not
that?
necessarily, because they use parallel structures a lot, so it wouldn't particularly imply that, you know. There is a sense, I mean, there might be a sense in which, like, the mysteries, that's a more important thing than the manifestations. But it's not from the characters, it's not clear that that's the case, you know, but that, I think that could be implicit in it, and again, I really do think it is my own kind of wanting to make it a little more this-worldly, to say that they're two equal ways of seeing things.
I think with all these translation problems, interpretation problems, which clearly the Chinese even have because there's so many commentaries, you know, it's really hard to say what this text is saying about how you should live your life.
Well, that comes to an interesting problem, right? So I put it back here at the end because I started to worry that the message that I'm sending is that you can't really read this text. And
I guess that's what my question is, yeah.
like, I don't think that that's the case, right? So I think that, like, what of the disputes? I mean, this is actually. I mean, I picked it because it's an extreme example. So if this is not nameless, but the non-being names, then it really gives it a whole different. It's a different content completely, you know. But in spite of all the variations, like, I think it is saying, first of all, that there's two ways of encountering the world, right? That seems to be clearly there. One is with names and with desires, and one is without names and without desires. And that's going to give you two different experiences of the world. And I think you could, what names and desires both do is objectify things, right? So they pick out things and sort of distinguish them from other things. And that's one way to experience the world, and then it is saying that there's some other way to experience the world, which would be to get somehow beyond names and beyond desires and to not objectify things in the same way. That seems to be, like, across all the interpretations, something like that remains, because that seems to be the sort of undeniable meaning of the passage. And then it's pretty certain to say that those two ways are actually the same thing encountered in two different ways. Right, so when it says that these differ in name, they merge the same, but they differ in name, that's, I think, to say that this is not talking about a split, separate reality that's the eternal Tao, and then our reality that we experience. It really is two ways of being in the same reality. You can either encounter it as objects that relate to you, that you name, that you desire, or you can sort of encounter it in a more, I mean, this is where it starts to sound sort of mystical almost necessarily, but you can encounter it in a less objectified way, you could say, right, where you're seeing the wholeness of things or something like that, seeing the connections between things. So I think that, like, that's a core of the passage that is why people always come back to it. And like, what exactly that means, of course, can go lots of different ways depending on how you translate it, how you interpret it. But it does seem like that's a kind of core of the passage. The first lines, again, because they can be interpreted in so many different ways, it's hard to say for sure what the first lines are really saying. But it is saying that anything that could be followed as a path is not going to be constant. Like all the interpretations, it is saying that. Now whether that's a bad thing and what you want is the eternal Tao instead of that, or whether that's all there is, that actually is open to interpretation in the passage, you know, and that can't be settled, I think.
That does seem to be the most dubious of all of them, to me anyway. That first line, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you grapple that? I mean,
Well, and you know, it
Yeah, I mean,
almost
you
is
try to-
directly telling you that you're not going to be able to, right?
I mean,
It's a-
It also opens up to the possibility of relativity, which is also a big construct around yin-yang.
Yeah.
Right.
The question is this yin or is this yang? And the answer is always, it depends.
Right.
You need to
Right.
know more because you can make that decision and come to a more, you know, to weigh the one against the other, you need more information, and the more information you know, it actually even changes the question.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I, when someone pointed out to me, I don't know Chinese medicine very well, but pointed out that the same thing can be yin or yang, depending on what you're comparing it to.
Whether you're talking about its
Right.
functional aspect or, yeah.
Right, I think that
Right.
changes the normal way people think about yin and yang as sort of two kinds of stuff or something like that,
Right.
right? Like it really is relational, I think that's
There's
really
nothing
important.
absolute about either one of them.
Yeah, and that's why I keep going back to Chinese medicine when looking at the DaodeJing, because that's the whole point. Yin is the mother of yang, you know, yang creates yin. It's a constant mutual interdependence. One transforms into the other, each is dependent upon the other, each creates and moves the other. It's the
always
Tao.
It's always a process of becoming.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there is no
It
still
never
point.
is.
I was just gonna say, in that way that can be followed is not a constant way. But if a person says, okay, he's gonna follow a certain way, do a certain thing, or develop a certain set of principles, he's defined it, or she has defined it specifically for him or herself, as opposed to, what about everybody else who's gonna look at things from a different perspective, you know, either humanly, or you can even go animals or plants or whatnot, because they would all be in
In an environment.
the way, in the Tao,
Yeah.
you know.
yeah.
So in that way, it's a lot less dogmatic than anything else that we're used to, you know, by the time you get to an age where you can actually even ask these questions of exploring other philosophies, you've already been informed by systems that are very dogmatic. So you somewhat, you have that expectation that, you know, that a work this old is gonna, now you're gonna really find out the truth, and yet it doesn't. In fact, it confuses you more.
Or you
Well,
could
that's-
say a dogged way is that dogmatic, or something along that line.
And what a wonderful way to open. I mean, if this is in
Yeah.
fact the first chapter, isn't that perfect? It's like, forget about it. If you're
Yeah.
looking for those kind of answers, you're not gonna get them,
Right.
you know?
Right. I mean, it's one thing they're trying to figure out how to talk about, I think, is that they want to recognize that every situation is going to be different, and there's not going to be any steady answer in any situation.
Right.
Even the Confucians generally have that view too, right? I mean, that's kind of a general Chinese view. But at the same time, this does give you some guidance,
Right.
Right. So it's not a kind of total like, just do whatever. There's no rules. There's no guidance, right? And how to think about that is, I think, part of what they're trying to figure out. You know, how
Right.
to talk about.
It's a user's manual for life that tells you, hey, there's no user's manual.
Yeah, see, it's not. That's the thing. It seems like that, but it's not. It is giving various kinds of principles, but I think
Right.
they're meant to work in a way that's, you could say kind of general variance or something like that. So it's not going to give you a concrete answer. And it's even hard to figure out exactly, like the emphasis is always on being more yielding, letting things develop of themselves. But even, it's not totally clear that its view is that that's always the right answer, as much as rhetorically we're always biased toward the opposite, and so it's emphasizing that. So even that's not clear that its real view is that you should never be the active side.
Right.
Right.
Well,
it never says to be the active side, but it could be more a rhetorical thing that it's trying to say, look, you're always trying to be the active side, so don't do that. Right?
Do you
Be the
think
weak
maybe
side.
they wrote it specifically so that everyone who reads it is going to take something different from it and kind of apply,
That
like-
gets
like-
back to what you said at the very beginning about it's partly the text, and it's partly the individual who's interpreting the text, and that there's the relationship there. And I really see that, and it reminds me of a friend of mine who's a poet, and she writes some poetry that's accessible and some that's very non-accessible. And I was kind of frustrated trying to figure out what does she mean with these poems, and I have that same experience with abstract art sometimes. And she, as a poet, described to me, there's this way of being with it that isn't about rationally understanding it, but letting it wash over you. That's more of a receptive way, and in the West, we're not used to the more
Yeah.
receptive way. So, yeah, I like that, getting back to the
Yeah.
yeah.
With the DaodeJing, I'm not sure. So I think, like the other main early Taoist text is called the Zhuangzi, right?
Right.
I think that that's written deliberately to produce multiple perspectives so that you can't figure out what it's trying to tell you, and it's always like giving you something new and a different perspective. I'm not sure with the DaodeJing if the authors meant for it to be as ambiguous and open to meaning as it is. I don't know. It's possible that they really, it's definitely not dogmatic no matter what, right? It's not laying out rules that what you should always do. Like clearly it's meant to be adapted in those kinds of ways. But I'm not sure if it was, they wanted you they wanted there to be so many different meanings of the DaodeJing, or if they really meant there to be a meaning, and they, I think part of what happened, probably some of it originated, you maybe wouldn't be just randomly encountering it, you'd be encountering it with a person who knew it, right, and they would be explaining it to you. So somebody, I don't think it's a good comparison, but somebody says, some of these Chinese texts are like PowerPoints. Well, like if you just had my PowerPoint, you wouldn't really know what I was talking about. You need me to explain what I'm talking about. It could be a little bit like that.
Well, two things. One is medieval grimoires. The thought is that those were the notes that students of the magicians were making, and that's why they're so ambiguous. They're meant to be shorthand or Cliff's Notes. But the other thing that just occurred to me is, has anybody ever thought that maybe this collection is a parody of all the other debating philosophers at the time?
Oh my God.
What if someone was joking and
man.
somebody took this as something really serious?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Well,
I don't think that fits
Even
the...
the Church of
No,
Bonn.
that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because you got all these chunks that came out at different times
Yeah.
that treat it seriously. Right?
Yeah,
So
I
that
think it's meant. I think it's meant seriously, as opposed to the Zhuangzi. There are parodies, and it's not clear often what's going on. That if it's making fun of its own views or not, and that kind of stuff. The DaodeJing, I think, is more serious. And one thing, it hasn't come up in the passages that I've brought up. I've only brought up a couple of passages, right? But a good third of the text is explicitly about how to rule, right? And so the text was almost certainly connected with people who wanted to persuade rulers to follow this path, and so in that way there is a kind of seriousness about it. There's a kind of,
So-
anti-war element and those kinds of things, that there's a kind of earnestness to it, I think.
So there's a political message in it too.
There is a political message
And there's
in
a
it, for
human
sure, yeah.
message, but I think, in looking at these problematic passages that you're showing us, that I do believe that we can't answer all questions, but I think if we looked at this long enough and thoroughly enough, we could probably resolve most of them, because there probably is consistency.
Yeah.
Philosophically, I see this simple line: nothing is constant but change. That's, that's what it says to me. In all of those lines.
The French, plus change, the men change, how's it go, the only, how does it go,
The only
The
thing
more it
that-
changes,
that's
the more it
constant
the more
is
things change, the more things stay the same.
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
I took that to be a different meaning from that, but I think certainly their underlying view is that things are always changing, right? But I think that, again, the danger with that, why it's so much more complicated than saying that, is that they do want to say that you can get some guidance about how to live. So it's not always random or something
it's
like
about-
that, right? So there's patterns to the change, and there's things you can learn about how it changes and how to function within that kind of system. That's the crucial part of it. I really do think that this, and again, maybe it was different people who had different interests, but if you look at it as a whole, the orientation is toward practice more than toward actually the theories about the Tao and that kind of stuff. I think that's more their concern, is how to live well and live effectively, and some of it is more, how to achieve contentment and that kind of stuff, but a lot of it is actually how to not die early. They say that all the time in there, and I think they meant that. This was meant to help you be healthy and preserve your life and not get killed, which at that time would have been a pretty common thing to happen, right? It was a very
It's
violent
written
time.
so you don't know the answer, because you have to think, if you're, one of the being brought up Catholic, they tell you what to do, and you're like, great, now I don't have to think anymore, everyone's telling me what, and I don't have responsibility. So this is you're responsible for figuring this out yourself.
Yeah, but that's still on levels, right? So I think that if you think about if we understand it, chapter 67, which I was going to talk about today too, says, I have 3 treasures. One of them is nurturing care. One is not extravagant, so frugality is sometimes translated. Another is not daring to go first in the world. So you could say, well, okay, we understand that, and those are guidelines, but that's not a commandment. It doesn't tell you concretely what to do in any situation, right? So it tells you should feel a certain way, you should be worried about certain kinds of things, but what do you actually do in a given situation? You've got to figure that out. You've got to apply that in that situation, and that's where I might have been too quick in saying the Confucians are also kind of relativistic. In a way they're not, but they also don't usually give absolute rules, right? Because their view is each situation is different. What you need to be is a wise person, and then in that situation you'll figure out what the best thing to do is. But there's no way to just say well, okay, you should always do this and always do this and always do this.
Right.
So it's still giving, I think, general, you could say, strategies, right? So they're strategies, but they're not rules, and it's going to depend on the context of the situation.
Oddly enough, what you're saying right now reminds me in the West of Freemasonry. Because the Masons are, one of their catchphrases is it's a symbol of morality, it's a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated in symbols. It's you could say to somebody, well, you have to be an upright person. The Masons won't define what that means, but they'll say, use that symbol as a guide. What would that mean to you to be upright? So it's kind of a level of abstraction, but still giving guidance in that same sense.
Yeah, I would imagine you find it in different contexts, partly because it seems like it's useful. You know what I mean? It seems realistic. There are problems with having set moral rules. In a way, every system that lays out very clear moral rules almost always recognize that people are going to sometimes fail to do this. You know what I mean? You're going to have to weigh your options, and I think the Chinese side is not even really attempting that, to lay out all the rules and say, well, yeah, okay, realistically you're going to compromise them sometimes, but these are the rules and you should always follow them. It's a more sort of realistic foundation, I think, to say these are kind of strategies or attitudes that you should have, things like that. But how that works out is going to vary depending on the context.
One of the things that I've found that I think when I just look back and think, what's the main thing I got out of, reading it, and tell me if you get this or if it's just me, but that I think it seems to say over and over again that any extreme is the same. all extremes are the same. That's kind of, because it seems like a lot of it is ping-ponging from one extreme to another extreme, and what I got from that is like kind of saying, any extreme is the same.
I don't know if I would say the same. I mean, there's some similarity. Any extreme is dangerous, right? So
if I was
there's
to
some
use
things
a
about the
physical
extreme.
thing, extreme cold. If you experience extreme cold versus experiencing extreme heat, I would think that either one would bring the same amount of excruciating pain. That at some point, the senses would go numb, and you wouldn't know one from the other, kind of thing.
Well, in the Chinese view, what they would say is when something goes to the extreme, it then flips into its opposite.
But they keep that they're opposites,
Yeah.
right? So that's, I think they wouldn't want to say the two extremes are the same,
Yeah.
but they're linked to each other.
So-
And if you get to one extreme, it's going to go back toward the other extreme. And the extreme is always
Right.
unstable. It's fragile precisely because you can't. It's going to go back the other direction. And so
Right.
there is a sense in which. Well, I don't think they would want to say that like extreme wealth and extreme poverty are the same, but there is a similarity to them in that they're both unstable, unsustainable, right? And so you want to have this kind of moderate level, But I think, that they're linked, that they cycle together, that kind of stuff. I would say, and there's certainly this focus on avoiding extremes in either direction, in the Taoist stuff and in a lot of Chinese thought. I think has that orientation.
Would you say it like that one could actually kind of be, the rising of one begets the other
Yes.
from their
Yeah.
viewpoint?
Yeah. Right. That's the second chapter of the DaodeJing says, once people recognize beauty as beauty, there's already ugliness. Right. Once there's good, there's already the not good.
Yeah.
I think that's the idea there. Is that as soon as you lay out one side, you've automatically got the other side.
Right.
But that goes in different ways, because I think the point there is to stop labeling things as beautiful and ugly and good and bad, not to keep a moderate ground between them, but in a way to give up those concepts. So it can go different ways. Some of them you have to just kind of keep a middle path through.
Like let go of the labels. You think it's
That there, I think it's saying to let go of the labels, yeah. But other places, I think, in terms of like good fortune and bad fortune, it's really saying more practically, you don't want to go to either extreme. You want to negotiate the middle between these kinds of things. So I think sometimes it's talking about the labels, but sometimes it's talking about the real phenomena.
It's
That
the
you've got
golden
the two
mean.
sides.
Yeah, the mid path is
Yeah.
the golden mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
well, I've always heard that the Chinese characters is extremely philosophical in that they're always like juxtaposing positioning things together. For instance, like is it true? I always heard this. I don't remember if it's true that the character for I think Calamity is the same character for what's the word?
For opportunity.
Opportunity,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's not quite that.
It
So-
isn't. So
No,
some
I-
Western people did.
Yeah, it's not quite that, but the word, as I said, most modern Chinese words are two characters together.
Uh-huh.
So the second character of crisis is in the same phrase
Crisis.
is in the phrase for opportunity. And the first character means like danger. But it's not really that it's danger and opportunity mixed together. That's not really what the Chinese means. But it is, because those characters are in like 50 other words, so it's a little too neat to try to lay it
Okay.
out that way, I think, But there you find interesting things in the phrases that way, but I think that one's one that,
A Western projection more than anything, maybe.
yeah, I mean, it could have been from a Chinese who was familiar with the West and thought this would be something that would sort of have some,
Like you
Look
said
good- it
last
would
time,
look
how
good on a
many
t-shirt.
phrases-
right,
How many phrases are attributed to Lao Tzu in our pop culture that
right.
Yeah.
never were? Yeah.
Mhm.
Maybe we should stop there. There's no point in moving on to the next chapter, I think.
Yeah.
It's
Probably
already
not, but
close.
this is fun.
Thank you very much.
Do like a few more weeks or. Poor Frank, we're gonna tie him down to the chair.